week, and this is kind of how we're moving forward because we're getting closer to Easter, and so I kind of picked up on a timeline to kind of move us in that direction towards the Resurrection Sunday. And last week, we were looking at Jesus progressing, kind of going towards Jerusalem and getting ready for the Passover. And Jesus goes through a town. You remember the name of the town? Anybody remember that town's name? It's a fairly prominent one.
Jericho.
Jericho, right, Jericho. Shows up in the Bible lots of different times. It is an ancient town. It's been built, and then it's been broken down and rebuilt again and built on top of. And when archaeologists are in Jericho, in that area, they know that they're dealing with a city that has layers upon layers upon layers of history. And so anyways, it was going on in Jericho, and Jesus is making his way through the town with his disciples, and he ends up healing a man named Bartimaeus. And everybody celebrates. Wow, look, the prophet from God, look what he's done. Right before us. All these things we had heard about in scriptures, there's these stories we heard. Now we're seeing a guy who actually does it. And so he heals this man that, they definitely knew of. He's a part of their family. He's part of that, community, that city. They know this man. And so this is not somebody they just brought in and say, oh, well, he healed him. This is a guy who's been there. He's been suffering with this. And they know him. And Jesus heals him. Then Jesus continues to make his way through the town. He's heading out of town. And then he comes across another man. What was his name? Zacchaeus. And he wasn't a great big man, was he? No, you might remember the old Sunday school town song. It was a wee little man, right? It was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbs up in a sycamore tree, right? A sycamore fig tree. He climbs up to see what he can see. And so he does that, but see, Zacchaeus is not no average guy. In fact, he's probably the richest man in town. And he's also probably the most hated man in town. When you want to point out the villain in this story, or you want to point out the person who is the oppressor of these people, it's Zacchaeus. Because Zacchaeus is what?
Tax collector.
He's a tax collector. What was that?
Chief.
He's the chief tax collector. He's not just the guy who is going to make you pay your dues. He's the guy who's over those guys. He's the guy saying, you need to press that family for more. You need to get to that businessman. You need to talk to that merchant. You need to go here. And so he's the worst of the worst. And he's also the richest of the rich. And so he's the oppressor. He's the one everybody would hate. Because he's not just a traitor because he's working with the Romans. It's their taxes. He's a thief. And he kind of alludes to that later on in the story. But he actually can charge whatever he wants. So it's not like today where everybody can kind of go get a tax code or something like that and figure out, okay, I'm this person and I make this much money and this is what I pay. They didn't have that liberty. It was up to him because he's the one who actually knew the letter of the law. And so if he says, Dennis, your taxes have gone up 10%. And if he says, Monique, I'm going to need your first paycheck. And if he says, Martha Carroll, that retirement's not going to happen. If he made up these things and added them to it for his own benefit, you would not know. But you'd suspect it. Because, man, he's living good. He's living real good. He's a rich man. So this is, you remember the story about Jesus? And there's this woman who's caught in adultery. And these guys are going to pick up stones, and they're going to stone her, and they want Jesus to say that they can stone her, and all this is happening. And she was a woman caught in adultery. She is a home wrecker, right? That's a scandalous story. The way Jesus handles that. This is more scandalous. Because this guy breaks up families upon families upon families. His reach, the ripple effects of the evil this man can do is widespread. He's the reason children go to bed hungry. He's the reason merchants can't get ahead and have to charge more to their customers. He's the reason families have fathers that have to go and work other jobs late into the evening and night. He's the reason for all this. He's the worst of the worst. And Jesus comes along and accepts him. This is the most scandalous of stories. This is one of those stories that when scholars look at how they put together these ancient writings, this is one of those stories that really catches their attention because this is one of the stories you would leave out. If you wanted to grow a fan club for Jesus, if you wanted people to accept him as Savior, if you wanted people to know his name and to love him, you would leave this story out. There's no way you would include this. This doesn't do that movement any good in their eyes. But it's in there. And Jesus shows grace to Zacchaeus. He calls him a true son of Abraham. Says salvation has come to this man, to Zacchaeus, the oppressor. And so where we kind of ended with the lesson last week was with us, we're going to encounter our own Zacchaeus, the people that we think, are too far gone. And they're not just indifferent to God, they're belligerent. And they're not just indifferent to you, they're caustic. They're trouble for you. That's who Zacchaeus was. He was trouble for everybody he ran across. And God shows grace to him when he comes to him in faith. And so, if you have a problem with God's grace to someone, that's your problem. If you have a problem with God's grace to someone, that's your problem. Your problem. And if I have a problem with God's grace to someone, that's my problem. That's what I got to do with it. That's where I'm wrong. And the story of Zacchaeus shows us that loud and clear. Because Jesus came to seek and save the lost. You look at Zacchaeus, the oppressor of the people, you think, can't be much more lost than that. And Jesus came for him. So that's how we wrapped up last week. Now this week, I just want to kind of start off this way. Let's pretend that you're talking to somebody. And they say, Ronnie, I'm just like Ronnie.
That's what I'm
No comments from the peanut gallery. Or they said, Phyllis, Phyllis, I'm just like you. Now, when they say that, what do they mean? What do you interpret that to mean?
We're human.
Huh?
We're human.
Okay, we're human. What else?
enjoy the same thing.
Enjoy the same things.
A sweet person.
Maybe just as bad as I am. What else?
A sweet person.
A sweet person.
Alone.
But now I will say something in his favor.
Well,
He calls every morning to check on me.
well, there you go. He's a sweet person.
One thing that you can relate to them.
Okay, they're relatable.
Yeah.
Okay. So if somebody says, I'm just like you, you interpret that a certain way. So if I said, I'm just like you, Dennis, I'm just like you, Ron, I'm just like you, Shellnut, you got a certain idea about what they're talking about, And so, Mike, if I said to you, and you didn't know me, I'm just another person, and I said, Mike, I'm just like you, what do you think they're getting at? Mike, I am just like you. I'm just like you. What are they getting at? Specifically, what's like Mike?
Overweight.
I think it back, I said decent honest man.
What's that?
Decent honest man.
Okay. If somebody said, I'm just like Miss Eileen, if somebody said, Miss Eileen, I'm just like you, what exactly do they mean?
Well,
Are they just like you? I mean, that's what exactly do they mean?
I mean, You think on the same lines,
Okay.
about somebody, I mean, about different things?
Okay. I think along the same lines. Jennifer, if somebody said, I'm exactly like you. Oh, another woman said that. What would that mean to you?
You're just an average person. You're just average.
Okay.
I don't know what you're getting at exactly.
Okay.
But like maybe your looks or culture or ideas on things or similar.
Okay. Well, just how do you interpret what that statement?
I'm thinking they're wanting to get to know you better when they're approaching that, coming to you like that.
Coming with that kind of
I wanna know
phrase.
you better, but I'm trying to relate to you.
Trying to get on your good side.
Okay.
Well, when somebody makes an opinion of something,
Mhm.
you say, well, I'm like you on that subject.
Okay. Okay, I can see that. So now you can think about specific things. Mike was talking about his girth, and you can talk about things that they might agree to you with, and you might talk about some other things like what Jennifer said, or what Jim said, but you can be very broad, right? You can be very broad. That can mean something real specific, or it can be very broad. You know, I'm just a human person like you. You know, I got the same limitations, whatever else. I'm a human person like you. Now here's the thing. When it comes to Jesus, that was the hardest thing for people to accept in the first century. That was the hardest thing for people to understand and to grasp onto in the first century. That was the first kind of heretical teaching that kind of got, talked about in different churches, and they had to say, no. That's not right. And the disciples themselves, and you can read this in some of the late letters like John's, they had to combat that. That was like the first big issue. Because here's the thing, Jesus was known for doing miracles. You can even read in the Jewish writings who are very unfavorable to Jesus. They actually call him a sorcerer in the old Jewish writings. Because they knew this man is associated with the miraculous, like what we talked about with the man in Jericho. Jesus is associated with the miraculous, the supernatural. Them accepting Jesus as God was not the big deal. They just couldn't accept him as human. Because they saw these miracles firsthand, they were there, or somebody who was close to them, who saw it and they knew was trustworthy, they believed it and saw it. And so you have the disciples teaching that, and so all this discussion about the miraculous and the supernatural with Jesus, it was just natural for them to draw the conclusion that this man was God. The hard thing was to think of him as human. That was the big hurdle. Now nowadays, you go, if you talk to somebody outside the church or whatever else, or you see people, going along that line of discussion, the hard thing is that he was God. Well, was Jesus really God? That kind of stuff. How do we know these guys? These are the kind of things they say they stumble over. In the first century, those communities, the hard thing was, is this man human? Is this a human man? Or is this God? That was the hurdle that people had. The fact that he walked our dirty roads, stubbed his toe, just like every other man. The fact that he was not a God here in some kind of protective bubble, and just kind of going about things just unattached and uninfluenced by the world. Jesus didn't walk around with a protective bubble. And so when we look and we see who Jesus is in the scriptures and how he's presented to us, the way things are painted for us, so we can know him and know about him, we see Jesus living with all the consequences of a foreign, fallen world. And you know the evil in this world. That's not controversial that this world is evil. That's not a controversial thing. That this world is evil. You lock your doors at night because this is an evil world. You go out too late at night, you look over your shoulder maybe because this is an evil world. You take precautions. You know things are going on because this is an evil, fallen world. And that's the exact same experience Jesus had. And so that's what we're going to focus on this morning as we go towards Easter. Jesus experiencing evil. Jesus experiencing evil. He's not detached. He's not walking around in a protective bubble. It has an effect on him. Jesus experiencing evil. And there's something we can learn from that if we pay attention. So that's what we're looking at this morning. Jesus experiencing evil. Jesus experiencing evil. Say that with me. Jesus experiencing evil. Jesus experiencing evil. And where we want to go, we want to go to the New Testament. If you have a Bible or some other device that you can get there, go to the New Testament. And go to the Gospel of Luke. And we can learn from how Jesus experienced evil. The Gospel of Luke. When you get to the Gospel of Luke, keep flipping, because like I said, we're going towards the Passover and the Easter resurrection. So go on over to chapter 23. Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23. Now where we're at in the Gospel of Luke is we're actually in the middle of the crucifixion. But what I want to do is I want to kind of get us into the right setting for that, because a lot has happened. And if you just read, say, the first chapters of John or Matthew or Mark or Luke, you would, and then all of a sudden you flipped over to chapter 23 here, you'd be thinking, how did we get here? Because I saw a guy who was healing people. And then I saw a guy who was feeding people. And then I saw crowds loving this guy. And then I saw this guy who had compassion on people who nobody has compassion on. And I saw this guy being praised. And other people wanted to make him king. And all this going on. And then all of a sudden, I flip over to chapter 23. And I don't know what happened. This man, this Jesus, is on a cross. Is on a cross. When the missionaries first went into the outer parts of Mongolia and Tibet with the gospel message, the language wasn't that good for them. They weren't that well, experienced in the language. And so they brought along pictures to kind of tell the story, the gospel story, so that they could begin to understand the gospel message. And when they would show people the pictures, they would flip on over and tell the story. And when they flipped over to the crucifixion picture, they looked at it. And then they turned back to the picture of the baby with Mary. And that's what stuck with them. Because the crucifixion is horrific. It's horrific. We have nothing to compare it to. There is no picture, a painting, however it might be, of a crucifixion during the time period in which it actually happened. Because it was too horrific to represent. People didn't dare To them, it would have been the most grotesque thing. Why would you paint a picture like that? Why would you draw a picture like that? Why would you put that on any wall or anything? It's too disturbing. One of the great philosophers of the empire at that time, Cicero, he said that no Roman citizen should ever have to fear a crucifixion. That it doesn't matter how bad you mess it up. It doesn't matter how bad you do. It doesn't matter what you do in life. You can just be happy to the fact that you'll never have to be put in that situation as a Roman citizen. Because that's how bad it is. And so we follow the storyline, and we get to the point to where Jesus is confronted in the garden with his disciples, and he's being arrested. And the person that comes forward as a sign to those that are with him to arrest Jesus is who? You know the story. Who? Who comes forward to kiss Jesus as a sign? Judas. Here's the thing. In this kind of environment, when you did that, when you were leading somebody to be arrested like that, you were considered their chief accuser. So it wasn't just a sign, hey, I'm going to show you who the guy is. When he comes forward, he is the chief accuser of Jesus. He takes that role. He doesn't just betray him. He decides that he will be represented as the chief accuser in this situation. And he comes forward. Sometimes I think we kind of westernize it, and we think of him kissing Jesus on the cheek. That wouldn't have been the case. With a rabbi, you'd kiss their hands. And so he would have come forward and kissed Jesus' hand in that total respect as a rabbi. Is kind of what you get here. And that's the sign. Arrested. He's arrested. Betrayed by a guy he's poured 3 years into his life. Judas is there. He poured 3 years into helping Judas as a disciple, and he becomes his chief accuser that night. And so Jesus can look to his disciples, but they're gone. They end up fleeing. They end up leaving. And they're no longer a part with him. And so they bind Jesus, probably in a chain. And they bring him away to the first trial. And then we see it begin. And what starts out as a trial, you get the impression really quick that it's not a trial, is this man guilty or not? It's how can we make him guilty? How far can we go for blood? It's not so much as whether he's guilty or not guilty. It's whether can we make him guilty and can we get blood out of it? And the disciples are not outside holding vigil. They're not outside praying. They're not out saying, we know this man. Do not do this. They're nowhere to be found. In fact, when they are questioned, they're saying, we don't know the man. And he gave them 3 years of his life. And he called them his friends. And when he was presented with them and his family, what did he say? He said, anybody who does the will of my Father is like my brother, my sister, my mother. And he said that standing in front of them. And they're nowhere to be found. And when they're questioned, they say they don't know him. Your closest friend, if you were arrested on charges that were complete made up, you were not guilty in any way, your closest friends are saying, I don't know the man. I swear to God, I don't know the man. That's what they're doing. And so Jesus stands in this trial, and what starts off with a bit of insult and mockery then turns into a riot. Because then we see Jesus smacked. And then he's blindfolded. And then we see Jesus hit. And then he's mocked. And he's mocked. and he's mocked. And so it escalates. And so once they have their fill of that, they decide, let's take him somewhere else, to some other leader, maybe Herod, maybe somebody else, and let's see how far we can push this, because we want blood. And Jesus is living with the evil of all these men. And so he's dragged away to all these different trials you see going on late in the night. How far can we push this? And we see the beatings increase, and the mocking increase, and the insults and harassment as he's dragged from place to place. And eventually ends up with the Roman governor. And the Roman governor orders the scourge. The scourge is a whipping. That they use a whip made with 9 leather strips. And into that whip they tie bone and metal. Because it's not just to cut the victim, it's to bruise them too. And he orders the scourge. And the Roman soldiers go at him. Again and again and again. It gets to the point to where they've had enough and they begin mocking him again. And they beat him in the head with a stick. And somebody fashions a branch of thorns and presses that into his head and say, let's call him a king. He said he's a king. And take his body with all the blood loss, all the bruising, his body just ripped to shreds. And they take him back to the governor. And the governor says, we'll crucify him. The crowd wants it. The leaders want it here. I'll give you what you want. Now, the brutality of this, the violence. Isaiah, when he talked about it in the prophecy of the Messiah, Isaiah says, this is Isaiah 52, he says, the Messiah will be disfigured. Not just beaten, not just pierced. He uses that kind of language. Disfigured. Unrecognizable as a man. And then you get a sense about how brutal that was. And you think, well, how did it get like that? See, there's another thing in the prophecy that says that when this happens, he will be like sheep being sheared. He will not open his mouth. So you see this man, this Jewish man who's been all through a night of beating and insults and all that other kind of stuff. He's already quite a victim of violence. And he's chained up. And the Roman soldiers have their weapon. And they start going at him. And they're used to, they're hard killers. They've executed people before. They've been in combat before. These are Roman soldiers. They know what they're doing. They know how to kill a man, and they know how to be cruel. And they go at him again and again. But he's not saying anything. They're used to victims screaming in pain. They're used to victims crying. They're used to victims cursing them. They're used to victims begging to stop. And Jesus says nothing. Well, that sounds like a challenge. Hit him again. Harder. He's not saying, I guess you didn't do it well enough. Let me try. Hit him again. 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 He's not saying anything. He's just
hate.
So by the time that frenzy ends, and he's dragged over to Pilate, Pilate looks at him and says, "Behold, the man, unrecognizable, disfigured." And he's taken from there. And the climax is they're going to drive nails through his hands and feet and bring him to a place of execution. He's already to the point he can't carry the cross. That's how bad they would let people carry the cross, carry the beam. They would force them to. They couldn't even force him to because that's how beaten he was. That's how shredded his skin was. That's how much he was bruised and in trauma and in shock. So they take him to the place of execution. And this is where we meet him in chapter 23. So Jesus is experiencing evil. And in the midst of all that horror, in the midst of all that grotesqueness, that violence, that brutality, that stuff that's just shocking to the senses, in the midst of all that, it shifts for a moment. It shifts from nails and wood and skin and blood. It shifts for just a moment. In verse 42. And we see Jesus listening to a thief on a cross next to him. We get the kind of wrong idea about a thief on a cross because this guy was not a pickpocket. For him to be on a cross, at some point in the whole process, he either killed somebody or he had something seriously against the Romans, like he stole from the Romans themselves. And so this was quite a serious crime. This was not a mere thief as we might kind of first think of it. But in verse 42, we see Jesus listening to this man. And he says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." See, a sinner asking Jesus for something. On a cross, in the last moments of his life, he's asking Jesus for something. But in that asking, there's faith. Because he has faith that this man dying next to him is not just a man. It's a man with a kingdom. It's a man with power. Maybe he heard him say on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Maybe he saw the character of Jesus in some way that just shook him. That this was not just a man, because this is not how men act. This is not brutalized men acting. This is above a man. And so he sees that, and he asks that. And in 43, Jesus listens and responds. And he says, answering him, "I tell you the truth." If you got a King James Bible, a lot of times they'll translate it, "Verily, verily." Whenever you see this in the Bible, "I tell you the truth," or "Verily, verily," that means pay attention. Because something that's about to be said is really going to grab your attention. And this is what Jesus says. "I tell you the truth. Today, you will be with me in paradise." I'm answering your request. Today, you will be with me in paradise. Today, you will be with me in paradise. All the blood loss, all the bruising, all the cuts, all the disfigurement, all of that's happened. And Jesus says, if you're asking, I'm giving. Today, you're going to be with me in paradise because of your faith. And here's the thing. Jesus lived with evil. Say it with me. Jesus lived with evil. One more time. Jesus lived with evil. He experienced it. So we could live without it. Say it with me. So we could live without it. See, Jesus lived with all the evil the world could throw at him. All the abuse, all the mockery, all the pain. He lived with it, and he lived through it. But Jesus lived with evil so that we could live without it. And that's what he's promising the thief. He's promising heaven. A place where there is no evil. A place of holiness, perfection, a place of reward. Because Jesus lived with evil and all the consequences of it so that we can claim this too. Just like the thief. And he makes that same offer to us. We see a sinner, a Savior, and a promise in this. And that's where we go. Because we're sinners who need a Savior. And we're trusting a promise. Just like he did. We got something in common with this unnamed man. Because Jesus lived with evil so we could live without it. All the evil you've seen in your life, all the consequences of sin. Why do people get breast cancer? Sin. It's a fallen world. Why do marriages break up? Sin. Why do children run away? Why do they become addicts? Why do you have those arguments that you can't get past? Why is pride still dominant? Why are politicians the way they are? Why does government have so many issues? And we can go on and on and on. Because of sin. Evil has its way in this world. And Jesus lived with it. I want to talk about a more corrupt government? The Roman Empire. And he lived with that evil so that we could live without it. One day, those who put their faith in him will live without it. That thing that you've known every day of your life since you were born will be gone. It will be paradise. We can claim that promise. As the music plays this morning, that's what I want to put on your heart and mind. That we can claim that promise. In so many parts of this world, maybe in our relationships, maybe at work, maybe in our community, whatever it might be, so many of those things that we see that are from evil. They're from sin. But we can have hope. Because Jesus said one day we're going to live without it. One day we're going to live without it.